one of, if not the most common questions I get is how can I fix a bum knee? Typically, this comes from older guys who are semi experienced with weightlifting and they're coming off of an injury that they got for various reasons. So, in this video, I'm going to show you through two mechanisms of injury how we can get to return to play or return to exercise from a major injury. So the first example I'd like to go through here is an ACL tear. Okay? An ACL tear means that we have torn the anterior cruciate ligament of the knee. Let's break down exactly what that means. So the anterior cruciate ligament protects the knee against anterior translation, which is the knee moving forward. For the purposes of this video, we can think about any motion that would cause the femorotibial joint to move back and forth, right? It is a very, very common injury in sports. You can see it a lot with plant and twist type injuries where you're jumping from one place to the other and twisting the knee. That's because where the femur meets the tibia, here's our femur right here, where it meets the tibia is not a perfect hinge joint. It does more than just go like this. I'll do this in a darker color so you can actually see. It does more than just simply bend back and forth. It actually has the ability to twist in the transverse plane. It does like this a little bit. That's because there's a muscle that actually locks and unlocks the knee. And you'll notice if you extend your knee all the way out, you'll feel a slight twist there at the very end range of motion. Okay. Let's get back on track though. You injure an ACL, all right? You go and you get your surgery, you get a brace, you go through physical therapy, you return to your regular range of motion, okay? Now what? Because yes, you have that range of motion available to you, but in very few cases that I've seen, does anybody feel comfortable expressing that range of motion? Most of the time, you'll injure yourself again. What we know is that with any injury to ligamentous or tendinous tissues, it takes a lot longer to adapt. So what is a smart way to go about bringing a positive adaptation in the gym or doing any sort of exercise that won't lead to further injury? Okay, here are two factors we have to consider for an ACL tear. Number one is called joint laxity. Joint laxity essentially means how much wiggle is in your joint, okay? Now, going through some physical therapists, your joint laxity may be severely decreased. You may have pretty tightened up joints. For some people, that's not always the case. It depends on how well they've adhered to their physical therapy and just their genetics and the mechanism of injury itself. By the way, the mechanism of injury, MOI, is one of the most important factors for determining how you should go about repairing an injury. And it's the job of a professional to explain this to you and tailor your programming to that specific mechanism of injury. Okay? So, the other factor that we have to consider is the strength of the muscles around the joints, right? In reality, this encompasses several things, okay? It can encompass stuff like the link tension relationship of your hamstrings and quads, but in general, we can break it down like this. So how do we repair the joint? Well, by addressing these two things. And luckily for us, they kind of go hand in hand. So by strengthening the muscles that surround a joint, we can help address joint laxity, right? Now, with joint laxity, we're specifically looking for tendon and ligament adaptations, right? But by working our muscles, we can get both of these outcomes, okay? How does that work? Well, essentially, when we go into the gym and we apply mechanical tension to our muscles, we get force that is transduced to other structures in our body, one of which is our bones. That's why we know that lifting weights increases bone density over time due to micro trauma. That's called Wolff's Law, WOLFF, right? But that also happens with tendons and ligaments, but at a much slower rate. Therefore, you have to be careful. That carefulness is what we call graded exposure, okay? Graded exposure is essentially what it sounds like. We are limiting the amount of load and the amount of tension we subject our muscles to, right? In the case of an ACL tear, if we use the full capacity of our quad on that, let's just say it's my left leg. If we use the full capacity of that quad and we put that stress through the knee joint, it's going to stress out that weak ACL, okay? Even if your quad has atrophied as a result of you not training with it for a while, you can still very seriously injure yourself. And not only that, but develop compensation patterns. A compensation pattern is when you lift something incorrectly by shifting the weight or the way you move in an improper manner. An example would be if I am squatting and I allow my hips to do like this. You've probably seen a video of a guy doing that before, where his hips shift to the side because he has a weaker knee on one side, okay? We want to avoid that. So graded exposure is a great way to overcome that. The other thing is targeted exercise. What do I mean by this? Well, we have exercise that increases the strength of the knee joint in general, but we also have exercise that is deliberately targeting the function of the tissue or stressing tissue in a special way, right? One such example is working with our tibia, doing tibial rotations. This is a difficult exercise to set up, but you can essentially put a cuff on your foot, right? Can you see my foot? And pretend my hand is my foot. You're essentially doing this action with your foot with a bent knee so that your femur is staying in place, but you are working the action of rotating that tibia in the tibiofemoral joint or femorotibial joint, whatever, knee joint, right? And that can help you increase the tightness of the joint and reduce joint laxity, as well as expose your tendons to stresses they aren't commonly exposed to in something like a squat pattern, which primarily exists in the sagittal plane, right? Graded exposure is, to come back to that, when we're talking about doing something like a squat, which I believe is going to have the largest outcomes in terms of improving joint function. It's a great metric to use as far as your overall joint health. And I think not a lot of people are doing this. They don't take traditional weightlifting as seriously as they should when it comes to return to activity, right? Or even just improving the quality of your daily life, right? When I do a squat, the first thing I'm not going to do is do a barbell squat. The second thing I'm not going to do is do something like a hack squat. I'm probably not even going to do something like a leg extension, okay? What we first need to make sure that we're able to do is bend the knee at all, okay? And with support, because what you got to remember is with joint laxity, you have a joint space, okay? This is our joint space right here. This is almost exactly what it looks like. This is looser than it should be. If we go and do an exercise that is not very stable, okay, you're going to increase your risk of injury. Now, do we want to eventually progress to exercises that are a little bit more stable? Yes, I think there are benefits to that. Here's the thing though. Not only is a more stable exercise generally better for isolating a muscle and therefore producing hypertrophy, which is muscle growth in a local region, but we're also preventing injury at the same time. If we can increase the muscle strength, right, in the target tissue around the knee joint, we decrease joint laxity and we strengthen those muscles around it. And it is a lot quicker road to recovery. So we will probably be on leg extensions, but we need to assess things first, okay? I've worked with people in the past that they simply could not do leg extensions because their knee was so tight. Their knee was not tight enough. It was causing them pain. They were feeling at the very bottom of a leg extension. They were feeling pain across the front of their tibia, okay? With an ACL tear, you got to be very careful with how far you're moving the joint space. So we'll actually be prioritizing exercises from the shortened position, like a leg extension, even though we might not start there at first. With something like a leg extension, you can imagine, let me erase this here, there is a lot of shear force on the knee joint, right? So we just need to start out with something where we can get a little bit of help. What does that look like? Well, frankly, it looks like this. Oop, grab this. It looks like this. And then this is a person, and their arms are across here, and they're laying on a bench, perhaps. I should have drawn the bench first and the person second. Okay? Right? Doing a hip thrust. With a hip thrust, your glutes, your butt right there, can help you out of the bottom as your knees extend upward. Okay? That is a great place to start these elevated glute bridges. Okay? You can even start on the floor with your back flat on the floor if the elevated glute bridge is still too much tension for you. Okay? It's always better to start out lighter because you can always go heavier, right? So you can start right there on the floor with these lying glute bridges. You're still working the knee joint, but you can get a good idea of how stable your hips are and how stable your knee joint is. Your hips play a role in knee joint stabilization. That's an important concept. I might dive into that on another video. But if you have unstable hips and then you go and you try and work a knee which has had an injury, that's a recipe for disaster. I would not recommend that for anybody. So you have to get your hips and trunk correct before you try addressing that knee, or you can do it concurrently, right, if you have an intelligent program, okay? So that is how I would address an ACL tear. Quad tear is quite the same, okay, with some more caveats that we can get into. With a quad tear, you've torn the patellar tendon, okay? Whereas with the ACL tear, we're a little bit more focused on the rotation of the tibial joint and stressing the sort of back and forth motion of the knee joint. With the quad tear, we're mainly focused on increasing that range of motion. Oh.
Teachers, pardon the interruption. I need Hunter Clay to the attendance office.
With a quad tear, we're not only concerned with just increasing the ability of the knee to extend, but we also are much more concerned with the length tension relationship of the quads and hamstrings, okay? Whereas in an ACL tear, what typically happens is, where are we at? Here is our, we'll just draw it like this for the sake of simplicity, okay? This is our ACL tear. So our quad tends to atrophy, but our hamstrings tend to stay pretty okay because usually you can work hamstrings pretty all right with an ACL tear. It's not that much of an issue, okay? What tends to happen with a quad tear is you get the same quad atrophy, right? So your quads are much smaller. Your hamstrings, though, you can still work them. They tend to tighten up a lot more, right? They tend to get super duper tight. So you have really tight hamstrings and a quad that cannot lengthen that much, okay? Recipe for disaster as far as walking goes. There's a lot of different concepts to cover with walking, but we'll get to that another day. So what you're concerned with, and frankly, the prescriptions are quite similar, but you have to consider, what is it? With both of these, you have to consider how you go about graded exposure. So with something like a squat, when you eventually progress to a squat pattern, okay, you might not need to start with hip thrust with someone with a quad tear, though I would recommend it. It depends on how egregious it was. I had a buddy of mine in college who went through double quad tears in both of his knees, okay? And they weren't terrible, but the nature of it was just that he could kind of go right back into squatting patterns. He didn't necessarily have to build up his glutes because he had a solid base and he healed pretty quickly, okay? So what we can do is we can adjust resistance profiles in order to get the adaptations that we want. If we want to be able to use more range of motion at the knee joint, we have to expose ourselves to that range of motion. Now, I wouldn't say it's very safe for you to do something that is super heavy in the bottom and light at the top, like most squats are, because that's where the most amount of shear force is going to be on the knee joint, okay? So you're going to have a lot of pressure on the knee as it's going out this way, okay? That's bad if your knee joint is weak, okay? It's not bad to do in general. In fact, that's what we want to get to be able to do. But we need to build ourselves up to it, okay? So how do we do that? Well, imagine we're doing hack squats on a hack squat machine. This is probably the biggest bang for your buck intervention that you could do if you're trying to get your knee back used to going in deep ranges of motion. Again, you need to have your hips and your ankles and your trunk right in order for this to yield maximum results. Consult somebody for that. Here you go. Here's your hack squat machine, okay? On a hack squat machine, you have a little bar that comes up from the side and you can load your plates on, okay? What you'll do is you'll just grab a band and you'll hook it on up here and you'll wrap it around right there. What that means is that as you go down this way, right, the band lengthens and it helps you out more on the way up, right? So it's easier here, and well, it's not really harder there. It's more hard in the mid-range, which is what we want. The mid-range of a squat is where your quads are the strongest. And if you load where your quads are the strongest, you're probably not going to put a lot of stress on your ligaments and tendons comparatively. And this is a good thing. The next thing you need to consider is how quickly you're progressing. If you progress a little bit too quickly, all right, you're going to put more stress on the tendons than you intend, right? Because your muscle is always going to adapt faster than your tendons and ligaments. You need to keep this in mind if you're recovering from injury, okay? I think that's about all I have to say about ACL tears and, blowing out your quads, and as far as returning to sport. To close this video out, I'm just going to give you a basic system you can use for almost any knee injury to getting to return to play. So, let's erase all this. The first thing you'll start out with, let's do this in black. The first thing you'll start out with is a hip thrust variation. Okay. The reason you start out with a hip thrust variation is, like I said, so you can use your really strong glutes, which have not really been affected by the injury, to help expose your knee to load. You can add a little bit of load here. Just do it until you feel pretty strong with that motion. From a hip thrust, you're going to go to preferably, there's two ways you can go here. You can go to a goblet squat variation with a press out, okay? Or you can go to a graded, the reverse banded hack squat. So for two, I'm gonna say reverse banded hack squat. The kettlebell with press out thing is more of an intervention that we use for hip stability in the squat. If we're just talking purely quad adaptations here, this is what we would go with. Now, the next thing I would say, you keep this in rotation, the reverse banded hack squat. Maybe you start using less assistance in the bottom over time. Add in your leg extensions, okay? Once you add in your leg extensions, you should be feeling pretty strong at the knee. And then at this point, I mean, this is a whole topic for another video, honestly. We can start talking about, instability interventions, right? We don't necessarily need to get on a BOSU ball. I know some people actually really like that, and they claim it's helped their knee a ton. I've never found it necessary personally, but I know people that have, and they've had great success with it. But even something as simple as throwing in barbell squats every once in a while can do wonders for someone who has a pre-existing knee injury. So if you're one of those people with an ACL tear, quad tear, or a meniscus injury, go through your physical therapy. And after that point, this is a basic system that I would recommend you try yourself, and maybe you can get a qualified professional to help you out with. But I'll see you in the next video.